In the Netflix series You, the character Guinevere Beck experiences a disturbing cycle that many viewers recognize, but few can clearly explain. After enduring subtle surveillance, emotional conditioning, and manipulation by Joe Goldberg, she begins to pull away. Joe senses this. He distances himself just long enough to make her doubt her instincts. Then, at a carefully chosen moment, he returns. He apologizes. He listens. He mirrors her feelings. He presents himself as changed. In that moment, Beck begins to reconsider. Her emotional defenses weaken. She wonders if she misjudged him. She opens the door. This sequence, fictional as it may be, reflects a psychological pattern that is real, studied, and well documented. It is called hoovering, a core manipulation tactic used by those who seek control, not connection. The behavior is not unique to television. It happens every day. A toxic partner suddenly reappears after months of silence. A manipulative friend checks in just as you find peace. An abusive parent sends a gift after years of emotional neglect. The return is often misinterpreted as love, growth, or closure. But in psychological terms, it is something far more dangerous. It is calculated re-entry, engineered to restore emotional leverage. Hoovering is not about making amends. It is not about healing the past. It is about reinstating a presence in your life that serves their need for validation, control, or psychological dominance. The term, drawn from the Hoover vacuum, captures the essence of the behavior, drawing you back in, emotionally and mentally, before you can establish full separation. This tactic is often part of a larger cycle of manipulation. Psychologists studying narcissistic abuse and emotional control identify several repeating phases: idealization, devaluation, discard, and then the return. Hoovering happens after the discard. It appears soft, even sentimental, but it is structured. It comes with emotional cues designed to bypass logic. It preys on memory. It activates compassion, doubt, and nostalgia. The person employing hoovering does not need to storm in. They do not need to demand anything. In fact, the more subtle the message, the more effective it becomes. A text that reads "thinking of you," a reference to a shared memory, a sudden expression of sadness. These are not gestures of love. They are probes, tests. They are meant to see if your emotional boundary still holds. This method has been documented in psychological research on trauma bonding and narcissistic behavioral cycles. In Character Disturbance, Dr. George Simon describes how manipulators use timing and emotional precision to restore their influence without taking responsibility for past actions. The target, often worn down by emotional fatigue, misreads the reappearance as sincerity. They may even feel relief. This relief is what the manipulator counts on. The moment you respond, the dynamic reactivates, not because you are weak, but because your empathy is being conditioned. Over time, manipulators train you to associate hope with their presence, even if their presence is the source of harm. This is how hoovering bypasses awareness. It hijacks emotional reflex before critical thought can intervene. In the case of Guinevere Beck, her response is not driven by love. It is driven by confusion. A confusion carefully orchestrated by a man who never stopped watching, never stopped planning, and never truly left. That moment in the story is fictional, but for many, it feels familiar. It mirrors a message they received, a visit they allowed, a second chance they regret. This video will break down the mechanisms behind hoovering. You will see how it operates inside a constellation of manipulation tactics. You will understand why intelligent, emotionally self-aware individuals often fall back into the hands of those who once hurt them. And more importantly, you will learn how this tactic thrives on silence, false comfort, and carefully timed emotional exposure. If you have ever felt pulled back into someone's orbit, if you have ever doubted the boundary you built, if you have ever asked yourself whether they have really changed, what follows will not only explain what happened to you, it will show you how it was never about reconnection. It was about repossession. From the earliest years of life, Many individuals are taught a set of emotional principles that sound generous, but are often dangerously misleading. One of the most common is this: when someone returns after hurting you, it is a sign that they have realized your value. The return is seen as redemption. Their reappearance is framed as healing. Their apology, even if vague or delayed, is interpreted as growth. The world around you reinforces this idea constantly. Popular films portray reconciliation as heroic. Storybooks tell children that good people always come back. Well-meaning adults suggest that time softens hearts and brings people together again. These beliefs are not just comforting, they are conditioning. They train individuals to lower their defenses when the very behavior they should be protecting themselves against resurfaces. What begins as cultural storytelling becomes internal logic. People begin to believe that emotional return equals maturity, that someone reaching out means they care, that presence alone means intent has changed. This is not emotional intelligence. This is programming, and it is the exact structure that enables hoovering to succeed. Hoovering, as previously explained, is a manipulation tactic. It is not a request for healing. It is not a plea for reconnection. It is an attempt to restore control, and it depends entirely on the belief that returns always carry good intent. In psychological terms, this is an exploit. It is a manipulation of your emotional framework. It does not ask you to believe a lie. It asks you to believe your own story more than the facts in front of you. The manipulator understands this. They know that culture has already softened your guard. They know that you want to believe people can change, and when they reappear, they offer you just enough ambiguity to activate that hope. They may not say they have changed. They may not offer a full explanation, but their timing, their tone, and their presence create an emotional suggestion. I am here because I miss you. I am back because you matter. I would not return unless something had changed. This suggestion is powerful. It does not need to be spoken directly. The person who uses hoovering techniques does not demand forgiveness. They wait for it to be offered. They allow your inner narrative to fill in the gaps. And once that happens, your rational judgment becomes compromised. You begin to question the validity of your own boundaries. This psychological response is not accidental. It is rooted in a deeper pattern called intermittent reinforcement, first observed in behavioral psychology through the work of psychologist Burrhus Frederick Skinner. This pattern shows that inconsistent rewards create stronger emotional attachments than predictable ones. When someone provides affection, approval, or kindness inconsistently, especially in a relationship marked by volatility, the target becomes more emotionally bonded. The mind begins to associate the unpredictability with intensity. This creates obsession, it strengthens attachment, and it makes detachment feel like loss rather than protection. In relationships shaped by manipulation, intermittent reinforcement becomes a tool of dependency. The victim is conditioned to seek closeness as a form of relief from emotional chaos, and when the manipulator reappears, it feels like safety. But it is not safety. It is a continuation of control, dressed as comfort. This is why the lie is so effective. It is not only learned externally, it is reinforced internally. The brain rewrites painful experiences to protect itself. Memory becomes selective, pain becomes muted, hope becomes dominant. The idea that this time will be different feels not only possible but emotionally necessary. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche wrote that the strength of memory is often determined not by truth, but by function. We remember what we need to believe in order to cope. When someone returns, your memory does not only recall harm, it recalls potential, the good moments, the emotional highs, the times you believed it would work. That memory becomes a gateway, and the manipulator walks through it without having to change anything at all. You may have been told that everyone deserves a second chance, that forgiveness is noble, that maturity means reopening doors. But these beliefs, when left unexamined, create openings for repeated harm. They create the illusion that emotional access is earned by effort alone, rather than by integrity, accountability, and sustained behavior. The lie is simple. Their return means they care. The truth is harder. Their return means they want something. This video is not here to promote cynicism. It is here to offer clarity, to separate cultural myths from psychological reality, to show that not every reappearance is sincere, not every message is meaningful, and not every act of coming back is a sign of progress. If you have ever been unsure whether to respond, if you have ever hesitated to block someone who hurt you, if you have ever thought maybe this time they are different, you are not alone, you are not weak, you are human, and you are taught to believe something that works against your own safety. Now that you see the lie, speak to it. Write in the comments what you believed about people returning. Write what that belief cost you. Like this video if it helps expose a pattern. Subscribe if you are ready to break it. Because the next step is to uncover what hoovering really is. Not what it feels like, but what it is built to do. Hoovering is a structured manipulation tactic. It is not improvisation. It is not an emotional slip. It is a controlled, psychological maneuver designed to reopen emotional access without accountability. In clinical psychology, hoovering is categorized under narcissistic behavioral cycles, emotional abuse patterns, and coercive control. Despite the emotional surface it presents, hoovering is mechanical at its core. It follows a predictable structure, and it serves a specific purpose: to re-establish influence over someone who has begun to detach. The term hoovering comes from the Hoover vacuum cleaner brand. It was adopted in psychological discourse to describe a behavior in which someone attempts to pull you back into a dynamic that you have already left, or attempted to escape. But unlike a vacuum that roars to life with noise, hoovering often begins with a whisper. It may take the form of a brief message, an apology, a nostalgic image, or a harmless question. These gestures appear subtle. They are not subtle. They are pressure points, disguised as invitations. A person who engages in hoovering may not show signs of overt aggression or dominance. Instead, they present themselves as reflective, vulnerable, and emotionally available. This is strategic. It neutralizes the target's defenses. If the harm they caused was sharp and sudden, the return is often soft and slow. That contrast is intentional. It shifts the emotional memory from pain to confusion. It interrupts clarity, and it restores the manipulator's place in the psychological space of the victim. According to research published in the Journal of Interpersonal Violence, hoovering is frequently associated with personality structures that rely on external validation, including narcissistic and borderline tendencies. This does not mean every instance of hoovering is pathological, but it does mean that the tactic often comes from individuals who fear loss of control more than they fear the consequences of their behavior. When the victim begins to reclaim autonomy, the manipulator feels threatened. Hoovering is not a celebration of reconnection. It is a reaction to perceived abandonment. The tactic is often built around 4 primary components. First, timing. The return is usually synchronized with the target's emotional vulnerability. This could be a birthday, a public success, a crisis, or a visible shift in behavior, such as silence on social media. The manipulator watches for these signs. Second, tone. The hoovering message is rarely accusatory. It is warm, gentle, or apologetic. It avoids responsibility while pretending to acknowledge the past. Third, memory activation. The message refers to moments of closeness or shared meaning. It reopens emotional files that had been closed for protection. And fourth, ambiguity. The return does not offer clarity. It invites speculation. This forces the target to do the emotional processing themselves. This method is designed to cause internal conflict. The victim may begin to question the reality of past harm. Was it really that bad? Were they overreacting? Did the manipulator truly mean to cause pain? These questions are not signs of forgiveness. They are signs of emotional intrusion. They mark the early success of hoovering. Psychologist Craig Malkin, in his work on narcissistic behaviors, emphasizes how hoovering often follows a discard phase where the victim has been devalued or ignored. When the manipulator senses that the victim is healing, they re-engage. But not because they miss the person, because they miss the control. The relationship was not built on mutual respect. It was built on emotional leverage. The return is not an apology, it is a signal. It says, I still have access. You still respond. I am not gone. What makes hoovering difficult to resist is its emotional familiarity. The manipulator knows what version of themselves the victim still holds on to. They recreate that version, just long enough to trigger hope. This is not spontaneous. It is engineered. It is based on what the manipulator has learned from past interactions. What worked, what softened resistance, what made the victim respond. In some cases, hoovering may escalate. If the initial attempt does not work, the manipulator may shift strategies. They might express anger, shift blame, or feign crisis. This escalation is not emotional breakdown. It is pressure, a more aggressive push to break the emotional barrier. And if even that fails, they may withdraw entirely, only to return weeks or months later with a new angle. The cycle does not end until the target breaks the pattern internally. Understanding what hoovering really is requires a shift in focus. It requires the target to stop analyzing the message and start analyzing the structure. Stop asking what they meant and start asking why it came now. Why this tone? Why this silence followed by reappearance? When viewed through this lens, hoovering loses its emotional disguise. It becomes recognizable, and once it is recognized, it becomes easier to resist. If someone has reappeared in your life just as you began to feel stable, if their words feel just true enough to silence your doubts, if your memory of pain is now blurred by curiosity, then you are not weak, you are being targeted. And that knowledge is not paranoia, it is protection. To understand why hoovering is so effective, even on those who know better, one must examine how reinforcement operates within the human brain. The manipulator does not rely on logic or debate. They rely on emotion, timing, and a specific behavioral pattern known as intermittent reinforcement. This concept, deeply rooted in behavioral psychology, explains why people stay in toxic dynamics far beyond what seems reasonable. The answer is not stupidity, it is conditioning. In the mid-20th century, psychologist Burrhus Frederick Skinner conducted a series of experiments on behavior and learning. He discovered that animals responded most intensely to rewards when the timing and size of those rewards were inconsistent. When food pellets were delivered at random intervals, rather than at fixed ones, the subject would press the lever more frequently, even obsessively. The unpredictability of the reward heightened the emotional and behavior investment. This principle has since been applied to understand gambling addiction, compulsive technology use, and most relevant here, dysfunctional relationships. In emotional manipulation, intermittent reinforcement creates a psychological trap. The abuser is sometimes warm, attentive, even loving. At other times they are cold, absent, or cruel. There is no clear pattern, no predictability. The result is confusion, and in that confusion, the brain becomes hyper-focused on the reward. The victim learns that love, validation, and peace must be earned. That emotional safety is conditional. This form of reinforcement alters the target's perception of both the abuser and themselves. When hoovering occurs, it activates this entire structure. The abuser, who has gone silent or disappeared, reappears with affection, regret, or nostalgia. The victim's brain, already trained by past cycles of unpredictability, responds not with skepticism, but with relief. The message, however brief or ambiguous, feels like the return of something good. It feels like progress, but this is not progress. It is repetition, and the relief is a signal that the reinforcement loop is still active. This dynamic explains why victims of emotional abuse often return multiple times, even after recognizing the harm. It is not because they lack intelligence, it is because their emotional systems have been conditioned. Trauma bonding, a term frequently used in clinical settings, refers to the intense emotional attachment formed through these cycles. It is not love, it is dependency, formed under stress and maintained through unpredictability. The manipulator, whether consciously or unconsciously, uses this to their advantage. They know that silence creates tension. They know that reappearance releases it. This tension-release cycle strengthens the bond, even if it is painful. In healthy relationships, reinforcement is consistent. Affection and trust are stable. In abusive dynamics, inconsistency becomes a weapon. The victim becomes addicted to moments of kindness, however small, and begins to tolerate longer and longer periods of harm in order to access them. This pattern does not develop overnight. It forms gradually through repeated emotional violations that are never fully resolved. The victim learns to lower expectations, reinterpret behavior, and assign meaning to small gestures that in any healthy context would be considered neutral. A single message becomes a breakthrough. A minor apology becomes a turning point. A returned phone call becomes proof that the first still cares. But care is not measured by presence. It is measured by consistency. And the person who uses hoovering as a tactic is not being consistent. They are being selective. They appear only when they are at risk of losing control. Their message is not an olive branch. It is a trigger. It reactivates the bond, resets the cycle, and pulls the victim back into the orbit of emotional volatility. Philosophically, this manipulation cuts into the core of human desire. People are meaning-seeking beings. They look for narrative, closure, and connection. When something breaks without explanation, the brain searches for patterns. The manipulator takes advantage of this need. They reappear with fragments of meaning, just enough to spark hope, and just vague enough to avoid responsibility. The victim, trained by reinforcement and driven by confusion, tries to assemble a coherent story. But there is no coherent story. There is only a pattern. Psychologist Patrick Carnes, in his work on trauma and addiction, notes that the strongest emotional bonds are often formed in situations of high stress, uncertainty, and unmet needs. The person becomes bonded not through safety, but through survival. This survival bond is precisely what hoovering reactivates. It does not feel manipulative. It feels familiar, and that familiarity is where the trap lies. If someone reappears after silence and your first response is emotional relief, if you find yourself defending their message before you even understand it, if you interpret absence as transformation rather than avoidance, then you are not healing. You are being conditioned. And the more you reward their return with response, the stronger the cycle becomes. In psychological manipulation, reappearance is not always a random event. For the manipulator, the act of returning after silence, abandonment, or cruelty is rarely about regret. It is not an accident of emotion. It is a decision rooted in control. In dark psychology, this behavior is categorized as a method of coercive reinfiltration. It allows the manipulator to re-enter the life of their target without confronting the damage they caused. Instead of responsibility, they offer proximity. Instead of truth, they offer timing. This reappearance is not motivated by love, clarity, or emotional growth. It is motivated by the need to test access. The manipulator wants to know if they still hold space in your thoughts, your heart, or your emotions. They return not because they are ready to give. They return because they are not ready to lose. This difference matters. One is vulnerability, the other is surveillance. Psychologist George Simon, who specializes in character disturbance and covert aggression, describes these behaviors as calculated. The manipulator gathers information silently. They wait for the right moment to strike a balance between seeming harmless and appearing emotionally significant. Their words are not revelations, they are tactics. They measure the emotional climate, and they speak in a way that makes them seem needed, misunderstood, or transformed. This persona is often constructed. It is not authentic. It is a mirror held up to reflect the version of themselves they believe you still want to see. If you once longed for affection, they show affection. If you craved accountability, they hint at awareness. If you demanded honesty, they speak in half-truths, wrapped in emotional language. The content of their words is less important than the effect. They want to be let in, and they know exactly what emotional door you left cracked open. Dark psychology does not operate through force. It operates through recognition. The manipulator observes your emotional patterns, your insecurities, your silent beliefs about love, and then matches their behavior accordingly. This is not connection, it is imitation. They mimic vulnerability because they have seen it works. They perform remorse because they know it disarms. They present softness to rewrite the memory of their cruelty. In many cases, the manipulator is not aware of their behavior as a conscious strategy. That does not make it less harmful. It makes it more dangerous. An individual who believes their own performance cannot be reasoned with. They do not view the manipulation as manipulation. They view it as survival. They justify their return by framing themselves as the wounded one. And if you question their intentions, they turn your doubt into cruelty. This is called reversal. It is one of the most disorienting elements of hoovering. Reversal makes you feel like the one who is closed off, cold, or incapable of forgiveness. It flips the power dynamic. The abuser becomes the misunderstood. The victim becomes the aggressor. This inversion is not accidental. It is emotional strategy. It forces you to question not only the other person, but yourself. It rewrites guilt. It creates emotional dissonance. The philosopher Michel Foucault wrote extensively about power structures that are invisible, embedded in relationships, not through overt rules, but through emotional control. In the context of hoovering, power is exercised not by making you submit, but by making you respond. Once you respond, the structure reactivates. The manipulator no longer needs to explain. They only need to maintain presence. Their mere existence in your emotional space becomes influence. This influence often appears harmless. It may begin with casual conversation, a simple question, a shared joke. These gestures are not neutral. They are confirmation that your emotional boundary is flexible. And once it has flexed once, it can bend again. The person who re-enters your life using hoovering does not seek your full trust immediately. They seek your pause, your reply, your time. What follows is a reinstallation of the same emotional mechanisms as before: conditional kindness, sudden coldness, shifting blame, rewritten history. The manipulator introduces warmth to lower resistance, then slowly reintroduces confusion. This process is not loud, it is quiet, it is slow, and it is deliberate. If you have ever read a message and felt a mix of fear, guilt, and hope, that is not coincidence, it is design. The manipulator is not seeking peace. They are measuring control. They are testing whether their voice still lives in your inner dialogue. They do not want closure. They want re-entry. They do not seek forgiveness. They seek leverage. They do not fear being forgotten. They fear being irrelevant. And once you see this return for what it is, you can stop reading it as a gesture of care. You can begin to read it as a continuation of control. Identity is not built all at once. It forms over time, through memory, relationships, values, and repeated emotional experiences. The way you see yourself is often influenced by how others reflect you back to yourself. In healthy environments, those reflections are stable. In abusive or manipulative environments, those reflections distort. Over time, the distortion becomes part of your internal reality. And when someone re-enters your life through hoovering, they do not simply disrupt your peace. They interrupt your identity. The person who uses hoovering as a manipulation tactic already understands who you were when you were attached to them. They know what insecurities you confessed, what compliments you clung to, what doubts you still carry. When they return, they do not need to reintroduce themselves. They reintroduce the version of you that responded to them. This version is not who you are now. It is who you were then, uncertain, forgiving, and searching for closure. They speak to that version of you because they need that version to resurface. This is the beginning of identity hijacking. It is not done through criticism. It is done through emotional suggestion. The manipulator may say, "You used to understand me. You used to be different. I miss the real you." These phrases are not compliments. They are commands. Each one is designed to create dissonance between who you have become and who you were when you allowed their presence. That dissonance is the opening they use to destabilize you. Psychologist Lundy Bancroft, in his work on emotional abuse, describes how abusers often attempt to define their victims, not in general terms, but in specific emotional language that creates dependency. If you were once called special, different, or irreplaceable by the person who later harmed you, that identity becomes difficult to abandon, not because it was true, but because it was attached to early rewards. Those emotional rewards created attachment. When the same person returns, offering you that identity again, it does not feel like danger. It feels like restoration. The hijacking is not instant. It begins with subtle shifts in how you speak, think, and interpret yourself. You may begin to minimize your accomplishments. You may start to question your recent growth. You may feel guilt for changing. The manipulator may frame your healing as coldness. They may describe your boundaries as walls. These are not observations. They are manipulations. They are meant to pressure you back into the emotional posture you held when you were more accessible. This internal conflict causes fatigue. Identity fatigue is a term used to describe the exhaustion that comes from holding two competing versions of yourself, one rooted in autonomy and one rooted in past emotional roles. When hoovering is successful, the manipulator does not simply gain access to your life. They regain influence over the story you tell yourself about who you are. This influence is powerful. It can cause you to doubt your instincts, reinterpret your memories, and even question your emotions. This process is called self-gaslighting. It occurs when the victim of manipulation begins to unconsciously silence their own awareness. They convince themselves that they are being unfair, too rigid, or too unforgiving. This internal silencing benefits only one person, the manipulator. In some cases, the victim may even begin to defend the manipulator's actions to others. They speak in the manipulator's language. They begin to mirror their logic. This shift is not a sign of loyalty. It is a symptom of identity erosion. The person no longer knows which version of themselves is real. The past version, shaped by dependency, or the present version, shaped by distance. Philosopher Søren Kierkegaard once wrote that despair is the sickness of a self that does not want to be itself. In Hoovering, this despair is not dramatic, it is subtle. It appears in the quiet collapse of self-trust. The manipulator does not attack the target's worth. They attack their memory, and once memory is compromised, the self begins to split. This fragmentation is not easy to detect. It happens in silence, in hesitation, in private thoughts. The target may begin to isolate, not out of shame, but because they no longer trust their own judgment. They may stop reaching out to others. They may keep the manipulator's return a secret, not because they are hiding, but because they are confused. That confusion is the mark of psychological hijacking. If someone reappears and suddenly you feel uncertain about who you are, if your clarity begins to blur and your values feel negotiable, if your voice inside becomes quiet and theirs becomes louder, that is not healing, that is erosion. And the longer they stay near, the more of your identity they will try to reclaim. It is a common misconception that only weak, insecure, or naive individuals fall into manipulation cycles like hoovering. This belief is not only false, it is harmful. In reality, the people most susceptible to hoovering are often those who possess the very qualities we admire: empathy, loyalty, compassion, and the ability to forgive. The manipulator does not target those traits by accident. They select them deliberately, because in the mind of a manipulator, goodness is not something to respect, it is something to exploit. Empathy is the most effective entry point. A person who naturally tries to understand others is more likely to rationalize harmful behavior. When someone who has caused pain returns with emotional language, the empathic individual does not react with suspicion. They react with concern. They ask if the person is all right. They wonder what pain they must be carrying. They offer emotional space. In doing so, they unknowingly hand over their psychological access. Psychologist Wendy Behary, who has worked extensively with narcissistic personality structures, notes that empathic individuals tend to overextend emotionally. They see emotional wounds and try to heal them. They feel responsible for emotional distance and try to close it. This makes them particularly vulnerable to hoovering. The manipulator does not need to push. They only need to imply that they are struggling. The empath will close the gap on their own. Loyalty is another trait, often targeted. A loyal person views relationships as long-term commitments. They tolerate difficulty. They value effort. When someone reappears with claims of reflection or change, the loyal person does not focus on the past. They focus on what could be repaired. Their attention shifts from what happened to what might still be possible. This orientation toward possibility is what the manipulator uses to reset the dynamic. In many cases, individuals who are vulnerable to hoovering also have histories of unresolved emotional wounds. Childhood experiences with inconsistent caregivers, conditional affection, or unspoken rejection can shape the adult psyche. These early patterns become blueprints. The adult unconsciously repeats them, not because they want to suffer, but because the pattern feels familiar. And what is familiar often feels safe, even when it is harmful. This is where codependency can form. Codependency is not neediness, it is the loss of self. In the attempt to preserve connection, the codependent person places the emotional needs of others above their own boundaries. They confuse guilt with responsibility. When someone uses hoovering tactics on them, they feel obligated to respond, not because they want to reopen the relationship, but because ignoring someone in need feels morally wrong. The manipulator senses this. They tailor their reappearance to trigger guilt. They speak in terms of vulnerability, loneliness, and fear. They say they miss you. They say they do not know who else to talk to. They say they have no one else. These statements are not confessions, they are leverage. Each one is designed to activate your caregiving reflex, your guilt over detachment, and your fear of being cold. The philosopher Martin Buber described two types of relationships: I, it, and I, thou. In an I-thou relationship, both people are seen as whole, valuable beings. In an I-it relationship, one person is treated as an object, a function. When a manipulator uses hoovering, they do not see the empathic person as a whole being. They see them as a role. That role may be caregiver, forgiver, supporter, or listener. The manipulator does not see who you are. They see what you can do for them. The stronger your sense of emotional responsibility, the more you become a target. This is not a flaw. It is a strength in the wrong environment. Just as a locked door is not a weakness in a safe house, empathy is not a liability in a healthy relationship. But in the presence of emotional predators, it becomes the very trait that grants them entry. This reality can be painful to accept. People who view themselves as kind, supportive, and emotionally aware often struggle the most to recognize manipulation. They do not expect deception. They do not prepare for it. And when it comes, it feels like a personal failure. But it is not. It is the result of being open-hearted in a space where that openness was never meant to be honored. If you have ever offered kindness in response to cruelty, if you have ever tried to fix someone who repeatedly broke you, if you have ever felt shame for giving too many chances, you are not foolish. You are good, and your goodness was studied, calculated, and used. There is a moment in every hoovering cycle when the illusion begins to break. It is usually not loud. It does not arrive with confrontation or clarity. It comes quietly, in the form of doubt, a subtle recognition that something does not align. The words sound right, but the behavior feels off. The message appears kind, but the history behind it is unresolved. This is the moment when your mind begins to separate appearance from intention. And for many, it is the beginning of freedom. The illusion of the return is one of the most powerful components of hoovering. The manipulator relies on emotional memory, not factual memory. They evoke the early stages of the relationship, the parts filled with intensity, admiration, and closeness. They bring up shared moments, phrases you once clung to, and images from the past that made you feel chosen. These fragments are not evidence of love. They are tools of persuasion. The goal is not to connect. The goal is to disarm. When you respond to the return, you are not engaging with the person they are now. You are responding to a version of them that existed briefly, often only at the beginning. That version was created to secure your trust, to mirror your desires, and to bind you emotionally. It was never built to last. It was built to hook. And once you were attached, the manipulator shifted. The kindness became conditional. The admiration became criticism. The consistency became chaos. When they return, they do not bring a new version of themselves. They bring a costume of the original hook. It is not growth, it is repetition. And the repetition is calculated to reawaken the emotional state you were in when you first fell under their control. This is not sentiment, it is strategy. It is the psychological equivalent of drug relapse. One hit, one high, one step back into the system of dependency. Breaking this illusion requires more than distance. It requires clarity. You must be willing to see the return, not as a sign of change, but as a test of your awareness. Every message, every vague expression of regret, every moment of charm must be measured against reality, not memory. Have they acknowledged harm? Have they taken responsibility without deflecting? Have they changed behavior over time, or are they simply speaking in emotional codes? In most cases, the answer is silence, followed by performance. The manipulator does not return with accountability. They return with softness. They want you to believe that the past can be rewritten through present attention. But attention without accountability is not connection. It is bait, and taking the bait does not lead to healing. It leads back to the pattern. The philosopher Hannah Arendt wrote that power is maintained through invisibility, the invisible rules, the unspoken dynamics, the hidden motives. In Hoovering, the return works because the manipulator's intention is invisible. They never state what they want directly. They imply it, and in that implication, they create emotional pressure. The target begins to ask themselves questions that lead to self-doubt. What if they are being sincere? What if I am being too harsh? What if this time is different? These questions are not wrong, but they are dangerous when they override evidence. A person who has harmed you repeatedly and refuses to acknowledge it cannot offer safety. A person who disappeared without resolution and returns without explanation cannot offer clarity. And a person who manipulates emotion instead of facing truth cannot offer growth. The illusion begins to break when you stop asking what they want. Instead, you ask what you deserve. You stop listening to what they say, and you watch what they do. You stop holding on to their potential, and you confront their pattern. That pattern, not the person, is what defines the reality of the relationship. Many victims of Hoovering wait for proof that the manipulator has changed. But in most cases, the only proof available is the fact that they have returned in the exact same way. Sudden messages, timed appearances, emotional hooks without substance. That is not progress. It is evidence of repetition. And repetition, in this context, is not benign. It is toxic. You may feel guilt when the illusion begins to fall apart. That guilt is normal. You may feel grief. That grief is real. But the breaking of illusion is not failure. It is awakening. It is the point where your self-awareness becomes stronger than their influence. If you are seeing through their charm, if you are noticing their patterns, if you are starting to feel less confusion and more certainty, you are not heartless. You are healing. And that healing is not invisible. It is the very thing they want to interrupt. Take a moment to write down one word that describes what you felt the last time someone returned without taking responsibility. Name it. That word is not weakness. It is truth. And truth is what breaks the cycle. There is no such thing as a random return in the psychology of manipulation. When a person reappears after a period of silence, abandonment, or emotional chaos, they are not following emotion, they are following pattern. The timing of the Hoovering phase is not driven by spontaneous care. It is guided by strategy. What may appear as a heartfelt check-in or a sudden realization of your value is more often a calculated test. It is a way to assess your current emotional state and, more importantly, your boundaries. The manipulator does not contact you by accident. They reach out when they sense vulnerability. Sometimes that vulnerability is visible. You post something online that suggests loneliness. You go silent in places where you used to speak. You are tagged in something that signals emotional change. Other times the vulnerability is based on the passage of time. Enough distance has passed for the pain to fade, for the memory to soften. They know that time distorts judgment. They are counting on that distortion. In toxic relationships, the manipulator keeps emotional tabs. Even when they are silent, they watch, they wait, they gather information, they study patterns. They know when your guard is likely to be lower, and they use that knowledge to determine the precise moment of return. That moment is not based on your healing. It is based on their risk of being forgotten. The comeback is often disguised as curiosity or kindness. A simple question, a vague compliment, a memory shared. These gestures are not neutral, they are triggers. The goal is to measure your response. Are you distant? Are you cold? Are you warm? Are you open? The manipulator does not need full re-entry in that first message. They only need confirmation that they still exist in your emotional world. Psychologist Sandra Brown, who studies pathological love relationships, explains how high manipulation individuals develop emotional profiling systems. Over time, they learn how you respond to praise, criticism, silence, and re-engagement. They catalog your emotional data. When they return, they use that data to build a message designed specifically to bypass your defenses. This is not intuition. This is practice. Even when the message seems spontaneous, it is often rehearsed. It has been rewritten, reworded, reshaped, until it lands just right. Not too desperate, not too cold, just enough to create emotional ambiguity. That ambiguity causes internal conflict, and that conflict is the soil in which manipulation grows. The manipulator understands emotional context. If you have recently experienced a breakup, they return to offer comfort. If you have had a success, they return to share it. If you are grieving, they return to hold space. But they do not do this to support you. They do it to reinsert themselves. These contexts are chosen not for connection, but for advantage. Sometimes the comeback is timed around their own life circumstances. They feel bored, rejected, devalued by someone else. You are not their priority. You are their fallback, a source of emotional reassurance. When other supply runs dry, they return to the source they believe is easiest to access. That source is often you. This reality can be difficult to accept. The emotional weight of the comeback often feels genuine. You may feel seen, you may feel validated, but emotional language is not proof of emotional integrity. The timing, the silence, the sudden warmth, these are not signs of love, they are indicators of strategy. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer warned of people who use charm, not to connect, but to conquer. He wrote that manipulation often hides in manners, not malice. The manipulator does not need to raise their voice. They only need to control the timing. When they appear just as you are rebuilding, they interrupt your momentum. When they speak just as you are forgetting, they revive memory. When they return just as you are feeling strong, they create confusion. This is not a coincidence. It is psychological disruption. It causes you to slow down, reflect, question, and in that hesitation, the manipulator regains power. In some cases, if you do not respond, the tone shifts. The manipulator may become cold, passive-aggressive, or even hostile. This shift is not emotional injury. It is tactical frustration. You were expected to respond. When you do not, they see it as defiance. That defiance threatens their control, and a threatened manipulator becomes unpredictable. You may wonder why they come back if they never truly cared. The answer is simple. They do not need to care to need access. They do not need to love you to want influence. The comeback is not about the past. It is about the future. A future where they are still able to shape how you think, feel, and react. If someone has returned at the exact moment when you began to move forward, if their words feel crafted more than spoken, if their timing feels suspiciously perfect rather than spontaneous, you are not overthinking, you are seeing clearly. And that clarity is the very thing they came to interrupt. Breaking free from manipulation is not only about physical distance, it is about psychological reclamation. You do not escape the manipulator when they stop speaking. You escape when their voice no longer overrides your own, when their absence no longer controls your mood, when their presence, digital or physical, no longer determines your emotional stability. This is not a single decision. It is a process, a slow and deliberate reclaiming of your mental space, one boundary at a time. The person who used hoovering to re-enter your life was never seeking repair. They were seeking access. When they lost that access, they did not experience grief. They experienced disruption. Your silence threatened their ability to control. Your healing closed the door. Their comeback was not a sign of connection. It was a reaction to your autonomy. To reclaim your mind, you must begin by naming the pattern. Not the person, not the emotion, the pattern. Once you identify hoovering for what it is, it begins to lose its power. You stop interpreting emotional messages as truth. You start seeing them as tactics. You stop asking what they mean. You start asking why they were sent and why now. Detachment is not indifference. It is clarity. It means you can observe without reacting. It means you can observe without reacting. It means you can receive a message, feel the old triggers stir, and choose not to respond. It means you understand that silence is not cruelty, it is safety, and in many cases, it is survival. Philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre once wrote that freedom is what you do with what has been done to you. In the context of manipulation, that freedom is your ability to act with intention, not reaction. When you choose to break the cycle, you are not simply avoiding pain. You are asserting your agency. You are declaring that your peace matters more than their re-entry. This is not easy. Emotional detachment from a manipulator often brings up waves of guilt, grief, and confusion. You may feel as if you are betraying someone who once mattered. You may worry that you are being cold or unforgiving. These feelings are common. They are not signs of failure. They are the residue of conditioning. The mind, trained to respond, will protest when you stop responding. That protest is not a reason to return. It is a signal that the system is breaking. Reclaiming power also means confronting the part of yourself that still wants answers. You may still want to know why they did what they did, why they left, why they came back, why they changed, why they did not. But the need for answers is often a disguised need for closure, and closure, in abusive or manipulative dynamics, is rarely given. It is built, slowly, through repetition of truth, not repetition of the past. The manipulator may try again. Their silence may become noise. Their warmth may become hostility. They may accuse you of being cruel. They may play the victim. They may try to provoke a response. This is not a test of kindness. It is a test of separation. If you respond, the loop continues. If you remain still, the loop begins to collapse. You are not responsible for their confusion. You are not required to explain your distance. You are not obligated to defend your boundaries. The very fact that they push against silence proves their intentions. They are not confused. They are entitled. And that entitlement ends where your clarity begins. Healing is not a destination. It is a state you return to every time you choose not to repeat the pattern, every time you choose your peace over their pull, every time you say no without guilt, every time you choose solitude over a return to chaos. You are allowed to grow without their permission. You are allowed to heal without their apology. You are allowed to become someone they no longer recognize. That is not loss. That is evolution. If this video brought clarity, share it with someone who is still in the fog, not to wake them up, but to let them know they are not alone. Like the video. If the silence you chose has brought you peace, subscribe if you want to understand more about the structures that control, manipulate, and confuse us. The cycle does not end because they stop trying. It ends because you stop letting them in. And what comes next, in the realm of dark psychology, will show how the mind is not only manipulated by others, it is trained to betray itself. Stay aware, stay awake, and stay free.